We gotta make sure that cheese is in the picture. Gosh, you were such a prim and proper lady. Look at those little crossed paws. Are you tired? Take a little nappy nap. Hi kids, welcome back to another Beats Party. I'm Mrs. Pizza, this is Cheese, and Winnie is outside because it's a beautiful day and Mr. Pizza is actually mowing the lawn. That's why we're in the back of the house, so that you just don't hear a lawnmower going, but Winnie likes to supervise those kind of events. So she's sitting out in the sunshine, watching him mow the lawn. And we are here today to talk about some recent reads. Why? Because if I wait too long, it's overwhelming. And I like to do this while it's a little bit shorter, but yet I still can't ever catch up. So we're just going to get right into it. We're just going to plow into my recent reads. You look so tired. She's also got a bunch of shots yesterday, and I feel like she's just been very sleepy ever since. Before I get sidetracked, let's talk about some books. The first book we are actually going to talk about is A Closed and Common Orbit, and this is by Becky Chambers. I actually read this in a reading vlog, and I will link it. This is yet another hit for me as far as Becky Chambers goes. Hello? Are you done supervising? You can be back here with us if... Gosh, you're warm. I love that I have a dog bed in here and yet both dogs are just going to sit on my bed. I mean, what's mine is yours, you know? A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This was yet another hit for me as far as Becky Chambers books go. I have loved every single Becky Chambers book I have picked up so far. As an author, they tend to do cozy sci-fi in that you are dealing with characters who are dealing with real life problems in just a sci-fi setting. There's a lot of really important conversations had in Becky Chambers books, but you never really feel sad when you leave one of her books in the end. She always has a way of making these stories both very deep and meaningful, but also heartwarming, and you just really fall in love with all of her characters. In this book, and I don't think this is a spoiler because in the synopsis, it talks about the characters we're going to be following, but I will give this as a caveat. If you are interested in starting this series, because this is a series of somewhat standalones to my understanding, these standalones, obviously, if you're reading the second one before the first one, you might get spoiled for a few things that happened in the first book. It is still a series. So in this book, we are following Lovelace and Pepper, who are two characters that are introduced in the first book. Pepper being a very much side character in the first book, and Lovelace being, or Lovey being, a little bit more integral to the first book, but yet still being just a crew member where she's definitely put in the spotlight in this story. We are following their 2 points of view, but that is actually not how they were referred to in the book. You are following the perspective of Sidra in the book and also the story of Jane 23. Sidra is the name that Lovelace takes on. She is an AI and she's trying to figure out how to be a person and what kind of person she wants to be, what that means to her, seeing as how she's always kind of been an AI existing within a ship, and now she has a body that she is living within. And then Jane 24's story, or Jane 23, excuse me, is the story of a young girl who has been genetically engineered to work in a factory on this planet, and all she knows is the factory. She is an artificially created human with some alterations that have been done so that she is perfect for factory work. When one day something happens, and not only is Jane 23's world completely rocked, but also her eyes are open to just how small her world had been and how much more is out there. You will like both storylines in this. I found both interesting. There's a lot of really cool conversations had because there are alien species that both of these characters are dealing with. Sidra a lot more is interactions that cause kind of the opening of conversations because Sidra is learning how to human, but she also is learning about opening up to people, learning about different cultures and how they view gender and relationships and sexuality and having children. And you're able to have really interesting conversations about this because you're taking out this I'm going to call it the stigma of being a human. You are seeing this from all these different lenses because you don't have to be stuck in the, well, this is what a human believes or the humans I've interacted with believe. These are alien people, and so you're able to have really, really interesting conversations without any of the prejudices that a human being would already have kind of baked into them. I feel like I went on that rant where I just did about Sidra because I wanted to talk about how Jane 23's storyline is my favorite in this, and I definitely got misty-eyed several times in this. You know where Jane 23 ends up, you just don't know how she gets there, and so your heart breaks for her over and over again because you know she's going to end up where she does in the beginning of this story. But yet Becky Chambers isn't going to let you leave this story feeling downtrodden. She wants you to have faith in humanity, and at least that's what I get from these stories and the potential that humanity has. And so you leave feeling like your heart is nice and warm and toasty inside of your chest. I really, really enjoy this, and I want to keep reading any Becky Chambers book that I come in contact with. The next book I picked up after that was The Only Good Indians, and this is by Stephen Graham Jones. This is actually the second work that I have read from Stephen Graham Jones. He had a story in, I guess I could go get it so you can see what it looks like. He had a story in Christmas and Other Horrors, which I read kind of around the holiday time into the end of the year. It actually gets top billing right here on the top of the book. It wasn't a favorite of mine, the story that he has included in this anthology. I really didn't have strong feelings for it. I think it was one of the longer ones, honestly, that was included in this. But it didn't influence me one way or another about whether or not I was going to pick something up from him. I did, however, come across this book in a free little library, had heard of it before, was interested, knew it was horror, and having to deal with a group of young men. They're all American Indian men that live on this reservation or grow up on this reservation. And at one point or another, you follow all of their points of view in the story, although it's not like a usual narrative where you're bebopping from one point of view to the next point of view. It's basically you're in one point of view and then you follow that point of view for a while until you have to be put in someone else's point of view in the story. These three young men, when they were very young and stupid, when they were teenagers, did something that they shouldn't have done, and now there is some sort of vengeful entity that is seeking them out. Here's what I'll say about this. This was a very brutal story, and I think that if you are someone that is sensitive to triggers, you need to check your trigger warnings before going into this, because there are some moments that were a little hard for me to read, and I am not someone that is sensitive to triggers. They were effective, brutal moments. There was some things in this that were really effective as far as horror elements go for me, but for the most part, it's kind of a brutal ride that you're on. There's also a lot of basketball in this, but then I had to do some Googling because it was such a prominent part of this book that it was like, I had no idea that res ball was even a thing, and that this has kind of turned into something that is very prevalent within Native American cultures. These young people playing basketball and doing traveling basketball teams, and how that is just something within their culture that has kind of grown and is very important. I found that very interesting. I did not know that. That being said, I don't know a lot about basketball at all. It's not something that I care about, which is fine. Not everybody has to care about everything. I don't necessarily think that this was scary so much as it was brutal. There was a lot of imagery in this that's doing a lot of heavy lifting, and I don't feel like I ever felt like that anxiety of fear so much as I was just like, whoa, good Lord, that was harsh. So if that's the type of horror that you tend to like or can enjoy, that brutal, hard things are happening to these people, this vengeful kind of entity that you're not sure, does this entity actually exist? Are people having mental breakdowns? The imagery that is being used in order to bring the themes into it. If that's something you enjoy, you might enjoy this. I've just found a lot of it to be really brutal and not necessarily scary, so I don't know if it was necessarily effective as a horror novel to me. I ended up giving this a 3. It was fine. I enjoyed it. I think I've already forgotten a lot of things about it. The imagery was really interesting, is how I'll put it. It was fine. It wasn't necessarily really successful for me, and I don't know if this author is going to be someone that I necessarily seek out their horror novels, because I don't know if we necessarily enjoy the same kind of horror, is how I will put it. The next book I picked up after that was actually A Fellowship of Bakers and Magic, and this is by Jay Penner. This was available on Kindle Unlimited, and it was touted as cozy fantasy with a baking competition, which sounded honestly stinking adorable. And I was like, yeah, That sounds like something I want to pick up. I did, however, actually end up DNFing this. I got past the halfway point. I think I was like at the 60% mark, so I count it. If I make it past 50%, I spent 50% of that book existing in it, so it counts. This is the story of Arletta, I believe was her name, and she is a human, and she lives in this magical world where there are all sorts of magical creatures just out there living their lives. And Arletta is an orphan and has had some hardships in her young life, and she's now an adult who has a passion for baking. She seems to really excel at baking, but she doesn't actually have any magic, and so she is kind of looked at as lesser because she's just a human doing regular baking that she just has a passion for. She's not able to make magic cookies or magic cupcakes. Magic croissants kept popping in my head, which I don't know what magic croissants would do, but I would probably eat one. She, through circumstances, ends up attending this big, huge, magical baking competition that there is some great big prize for, and she's competing against all these magical creatures that would possibly have an upper hand because they have magic. There's also this male character that kind of comes in, and romancy things start happening, and I'm pretty sure he's an elf or a fae. I think it was an elf. I think he's an elf. Here's what I'll say about this. There was a lot of elements to this that didn't feel original. It felt like a bunch of things I've already read before, kind of thrown in a blender and regurgitated. If you're looking for something low stakes, more on the cozy competition vibe, this had that. It had magical characters, but everything felt incredibly predictable. I knew exactly where it was going, and I think for some people that is cozy. They don't want twists and turns. They just want the story to follow these beats and do exactly what you think you're going to do. If that's so, I'm happy for you because you just found a book that you're probably going to like. I, on the other hand, was getting really bored because I could have told you, I didn't even finish the book and I know exactly what's going to happen, what the conflicts are going to be. Like, there was not going to be any surprises. And I also kind of got irritated because this was advertised as a cozy baking competition, and we had just gotten to the baking competition, I believe, at the 40-something% mark, which if it's not going to be the majority of the story, we're almost at the halfway point of the story, it needs to be a much smaller part, or if it's going to be the majority of the story, it needs to be a much larger part. It just kind of felt like we spent a lot of time getting to the baking competition, but it didn't actually feel like we were spending a lot of time within the competition itself. There was, even once we were at the competition moments felt very glossed over. I think the author of this likes the Great British Bake Off, as most people do, and they wanted to write a cozy fantasy romance with Great British Bake Off vibes. And they tried. I didn't like it. You might like it. I just wasn't in the correct mood for it, I don't think. And I just didn't like how I knew exactly what was going to happen. So I DNF'd it. The next book I ended up picking up after that, I got from audiobook through the library, and that was Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism, and this is by Amanda Montell. This is a book that I believe has been out for a while now, and I highly recommend this as an audiobook. It was kind of an easy listen while I was walking the dogs, doing things around the house, and I found it very interesting. This is an introduction type book. This is not if you are very into language and cults and all of that kind of stuff. I feel like you probably either know a lot of this or wouldn't necessarily be entertained by this. This felt very surface level introduction into this thing, which the author has labeled as cultish, or this way that these groups can have these certain ways that they speak and their certain words that they use, their verbiage being very specific to these groups. I will say though, after listening to this book, I feel like I am very aware of when this is happening in my own life. Not only when I formerly worked at another company, it kind of like popped in my head where I was like, oh, there was one thing in particular where they would never let you say like, you're welcome or no worries when someone said thank you to you. You were always supposed to say my pleasure, because there was a lot. I remember the owner being very upset if someone said no worries, because apparently that implied that at one point there was a worry. I don't know. I also feel like when a lot of people talk about how they speak in a business sense, like when they're talking professionally, whether it's to clients or other people in their job, how they have a certain way that they word emails or they speak in meetings. There's a lot of things like that as well. So it's interesting that I've been able to kind of like, we're talking a little cultish over here. That being said, this book does touch on kind of how cults use language a little bit, but it also talks about how MLMs use this kind of language, how even groups like CrossFit and SoulCycle have kind of cultish behavior and they have these certain words and things that they use, social media influencers, how this language is found in a lot of facets of our lives. It's interesting. I feel like now I'm very aware of what is happening, but also it's not that I'm going to stop it in my everyday life, and not that probably anyone that's read this book, it might just send up a little light in the back of your head where you're like, well, that's a little bit cultish. Totally fine, easy listen. If you're someone that listens to a lot of true crime podcasts and things like that, I felt like this felt in that same way, much more conversational, but leading you down these paths, these red strings, kind of interconnecting different things. The next book I picked up after that was Peaches and Honey, These Immortal Truths, and this is by Raeta. This book is one of those books that I picked up on an absolute whim. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. I literally have no idea how I found it. Maybe someone mentioned it, and then when I saw it again going through Kindle Unlimited, it looked familiar enough that I decided to click on it. I will give you a little asterisk. The cover of this looks like it's going to be a very spicy fantasy romance time. Even the actual title, Peaches and Honey, sounds like it's going to just be spicy face smut. That is not what this is. And I feel like if you go into this expecting that, you might be a little bit disappointed. That being said, this is kind of a fantasy romance, and there is kind of a little bit, very minimal spice is how I'll put it. It's not rated PG by any means, but the point of the story is not spice. Here's how I will explain this book to you, and hopefully you pick it up, because I was so stinking pleasantly surprised by this book that I had zero expectations for. This book is kind of like a soul sister to The Invisible Life of Addie Laurue. If you read The Invisible Life of Addie Laurue by B.E. Schwab and you enjoyed it, but your criticism was that this character lives through centuries and we don't get the centuries, read Peaches and Honey. This is a similar-ish premise where we have a character named Anna who has vitiligo, and she has it in a time where people will look at her and see it as perhaps some contagion or sign of witchcraft. I believe this story starts in like the 1100s. It starts a stinking long-ass time ago. And so obviously people had small minds and no knowledge, and so she is living alone in the wilderness as a young woman. Do you need to go see what he's doing? Go, my friends. Anna is living as a young woman and really just trying to not be seen. She's just trying her best to stay a secret. When one day she encounters a beautiful young woman who's being chased by a group of, I assume they're villagers, some awful people who've decided that this beautiful young woman has something to do with something that happened, you know? This chance encounter where Anna decides to not only put herself at risk by helping this person, but also offering this person some of the little food and comforts that she has, even though she has little, she's struggling herself and she doesn't even know this person. But Anna has this opportunity happen where she doesn't realize that she's helping a god. Now, in this, Anna is gifted something that then sets her down a path where she is now immortal, but she has no powers, which is a very interesting thing. She has the immortality of the gods in this world, and you get kind of little hints and peeks at different gods that exist in this world over time, but it's kind of the question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Are gods truly powerful, and so they are immortal, or are they immortal, and so they then become powerful? Now, that being said, there are gods in this world that have actual powers, but Anna really is the best of these people because she has so much empathy and uses her immortality to help everyone she can. She then spends centuries traveling through time and kind of bumping into historic events. There's some really sweet moments that happen in this book. There's some really sad moments that happen in this book. But Anna, throughout it all, stays just empathetic and wanting to help those around her. And also, she's just a woman surviving in these times where women couldn't make much much money. She's trying her best to get by. I feel like in a lot of these, and some of the characters in this book as well, it's like they have a lot of wealth and they can do whatever they want and they're charming and they're beautiful. Where Anna has this skin condition that she doesn't want people to see because they might think she's a witch or that she's contagious, so she has to hide parts of herself. She wants to not be noticed. She wants to sink into the background and do her good deeds without anyone really knowing it was her, or just making the impact that she can as a single person who has the superpower of time. She's lived through a lot of these things before. She sees multiple wars, and every time a new war comes up, she kind of knows the beats it's going to go through. It's really interesting. I had a really good time with it. And then at the end of this book, we're kind of put into a moment where you want to read the next book because you don't know how Anna and her love interest are going to continue on. There's the background of there are other immortals, there are other gods, they do have magical powers, and Anna is at risk because she's just a girl who just doesn't die. I really enjoyed this. If you liked The Invisible Life of Addie Laurue and you wanted something else kind of similar to that, where there's gods and immortality, I think you would like this, but this is a very different story. It's almost like the author took that framework and said, well, this is the story I would have created with that writing prompt. Like these two authors were sitting in the same creative writing class, got the same exact prompt, and went in two very different directions. I really liked it. It was a fun little surprise, and I think it needs a new cover because the cover looks like very sexy times. And this was not like dirty, smutty, sexy times. The next book, speaking of dirty, sexy, smutty times, the next book I picked up after that was Bride by Hazelwood. This is the arranged marriage of a vampire and a werewolf who are on opposing sides of a conflict between vampires and werewolves, and they get put in a marriage together for political reasons. And, you know, spicy times. If you like Hazelwood books, you will like this. If you don't like Hazelwood books, you probably won't like this. This is the first traditionally published kind of paranormal romance by this author. She has written things like The Love Hypothesis, Love Theoretically. There's a whole lot of kind of women in STEM related romance books that have been published from this author. And this is her first paranormal romance. I can report that since she is very notorious for doing giant big man, tiny little lady in her romance books. I mean, we have a giant big man. He's a werewolf, but we have a vampire and she's also quite tall. So it's not tiny, small lady this time. She changed it up just a little bit. I enjoyed this. I enjoy these books. I don't expect much from them except a spicy good time with maybe that puts a smile on your face with some of the banter. I don't think everyone's going to like this. I did have my problems with the third act conflict in this. I thought it was kind of dumb, but I was still having a great time. If you have liked Hazelwood books in the past and you were worried about picking this up because you thought it was too different because it was paranormal creatures, it's not. It's not. It's another Hazelwood romance. But also there's nodding. So if you've ever read a werewolf book before, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't Google it. You don't want to know. Or maybe Google it. I can't stop you. Just, you've been warned. The next book I picked up after that was another nonfiction that came through from the library. This period in time was like my nonfiction from the library audiobook moments. And that was Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? And Other Questions About Death. And this is by Doughty, I believe is how it's pronounced. I don't know much about this author, but through context clues, I believe they are someone that, well, I know they are a mortician, but I believe they have some sort of like social media type presence. I don't know if they go on podcasts and talk about being a mortician, if they have their own podcast. I did not Google. You can Google if you need to know. I will say the audiobook is narrated by the author, and they seemed very comfortable kind of talking into a microphone, so I think they have some sort of public-facing presence. This book, which has a fantastic title, and that's why I picked it up, has turned me into someone that will be absolutely insufferable at parties because I have so many facts about what happens to people's dead bodies. This is a collection of questions that this author has been asked by children throughout their career, and they give you the answers to their questions. Some of them are super funny, like, will my cat eat my eyeballs? Spoiler, yes, your cat will eat your eyeballs. But there's more to it than that. There is also also questions about what happens to your body if you die in certain places or in certain situations, what you can be buried with, what you can't be buried with. It's lighthearted and funny, but it's talking about dead bodies. It was totally a fun read, and I have a lot of really dumb facts just rambling around in my head that I can't wait to bring up in normal conversation and freak people out. The last two books, because I usually stop at 8, but we're going to lump these two together because 1, they were both very short, but 2, they actually came from the same series. Similar to around Halloween, they had a series of short stories come out from Amazon. They were all kind of like lumped in together. There wasn't like a through line or anything. It was just a bunch of well-known horror authors that were doing these Amazon exclusive, available on Kindle Unlimited kind of short stories. Similarly, around Valentine's Day, these really short stories all written by somewhat recognizable romance authors. And it was Valentine's Day time, and I wanted to read some super short little romances. The name of the series was the Improbable Meet Cute series, and I just kind of cherry picked from authors I was interested in, which is something you can definitely do. Even though these are all in a series, none of these stories are interconnected. You pick whatever author you feel like reading or whatever synopsis tickles your fancy. The first one I picked up is With Any Luck, and this is by Ashley Poston. This is the story of Audrey, whose best friend is getting married, and Audrey, I believe her last name was Love, is kind of like Good Luck Chuck. Basically, she has some sort of curse on her, and whoever she kisses will meet their true love within 24 hours. And it's been happening Audrey's entire life. Anyone she kisses, 24 hours later, finds someone else, and that's the person that is their soulmate, and they marry, and they go on to live happy lives with. She is at her best friend's, well, she gets wherever the heck she is for her best friend's wedding, and they go out, and her best friend is the groom, and so they go out for his bachelor party, and the bride, her best friend, is actually a guy that has some sort of one-night stand history with our main character. Basically, they spend the entirety of this very short novel. It's like The Hangover, where they wake up and they can't remember what happened to the groom. He's missing. We got to go find him. And so they run around going to find him. This was fine. It really was fine. It's really short. And I will say, and this was my problem with the other short story in this as well, these are incredibly short romance novels that get you to the point where the happily ever after would start. So it's all of the buildup to them getting to the point where they're about to be a couple, and that's where the story ends. And really, that feels unsatisfying, at least to me as a reader. I like at least one moment where these people they're a couple now, like where we've reached the point where they've actually started the actual romance. And that doesn't happen in at least the 2 stories that I read. This was absolutely fine. It's honestly very forgettable, but if you needed something quick and easy, it was quick and easy. The other book I read from the series is by Addie Jimenez, and that is The Worst Wingman Ever. And this one was a lot sadder than I even was expecting for a really short, like, rom-com series. This is the story of Holly. She's a hospice nurse, and she is actually being the hospice nurse for her grandmother, who is going to pass away very soon. She's going to her grandmother's house every day and kind of doing end-of-life care for her grandmother at her grandmother's apartment. So Holly's going through some really sad times. Our other point of view in this is actually a young man who's also just kind of gone through some really sad times and is at a point in his life where he's kind of trying to restart himself. This one was cute because a lot of the initial interaction between these two are through notes that are left on Holly's car. Holly has a car that apparently looks exactly like someone else's car, and a Valentine's Day note gets stuck on her windshield when she was not the intended recipient. So then there's a back and forth leaving notes on Holly's car. So there is like a cute little letter writing thing happening, and that was very sweet. But this story had a lot of really sad things going on. And again, we literally get the point where the romance is about to begin and then credits. And it felt very unsatisfying to me. I at least needed one, I needed the epilogue to the very short story where they're like, this is what they're doing now, and they're super happy and great. You're, I guess, supposed to infer that it happens after there, if that's something that you don't mind. These are cute and easy to get through for the most part. I didn't love them. But, I don't need to. They were just supposed to kind of be short little rom-coms. I wasn't expecting grandma to die, but whatever. But that, kids, is where we are going to end this recent reads because I have talked plenty and my voice is going to go soon. I hope that you at least found one book that sounded interesting that you can add to your TBR or one you can take off because I made it sound awful. Like, I don't want to read that anymore. She made it sound awful. But if you had fun hanging out with the dogs who left and me, please subscribe. I hope you're reading good books out there, wherever you are. And I'll see you next time.